If you've ever had a moment in your life when someone looked at you just once and you knew in that look that they were judging you, then today's story will probably bring back many memories. Unpleasant memories. Memories that sometimes we hide, sometimes we try to forget, but they still smolder somewhere. If you've ever been told you don't belong there, if you've ever been rejected because of the way you look, the clothes you wear, the skin you were born with, or if you've ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly and wished you had the courage to stand up, then stay with me. This story is for you. Before we begin, if you want to hear more life stories, true and deep stories, stories that can make you think a little about yourself, about this world, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. Let's get started. That afternoon at Hudson International Airport, one of the busiest airports on the east coast of the United States, the atmosphere was a mixture of fatigue and the heat of late June summer. Long lines of passengers lined up at the security check area. Children cried from exhaustion. Adults kept looking at their watches, afraid of missing their flights. The strong smell of coffee from the counter near Gate B22 mixed with the dense loudspeaker announcements, creating a feeling that was both familiar and a little overwhelming, like any other major airport in the United States. At Gate C17, where Skywave Airlines Flight 417 to San Francisco was about to depart, a man stood silently beside a gray metal chair. A man no one noticed, no one thought about. No one knew that just 30 minutes later his name would send the entire flight attendant team into a storm. His name is Damien Cole, a black man in his late 50s, tall, but with the gentleness in his eyes of someone who had lived through many events without letting them make him tough. He wore a charcoal hoodie, simple jeans, and sneakers with worn heels. On the outside, there was nothing to say who he was, nothing special to draw attention to, and perhaps that is why the story begins. Damien pulled the gray suitcase next to him closer, holding the paper boarding pass he had printed from home. He had chosen to print it out of habit. Perhaps being in his 40s made people prefer to hold something real in their hands instead of relying on a phone screen. Anything real felt more reassuring. The first-class gates began to admit passengers. There were businessmen in shiny suits, a few older people who looked used to luxury travel, and a few young people who looked successful. Lightning cables, laptops, expensive perfume. Occasionally, a business conversation would break out. The CEO just signed a new contract. The market is bad. Take this flight and have a meeting as soon as you land. Damien stood up, adjusted the straps of his backpack, and nodded slightly to the counter clerk. A very ordinary, very gentle moment. A moment that should have been nothing memorable, until the woman in the navy blue airline uniform stepped in front of Damien. Her name was Karen Mitchell, the flight attendant. Karen didn't see a man tired from working all week. Didn't see a father trying to get home in time for weekend dinner. Didn't see anything human in him. She only saw the hoodie and his skin. She frowned, soft but distant. "Sir, this line is the entrance to first class." Her voice was calm, but there was something about it that made Damien pause for a second. He smiled politely. "I know. I'm flying first class." Karen didn't smile back. She didn't reach out for his boarding pass to check it as was the norm. She just glanced up and down at him, then leaned forward as if to block his path. "Sir, I'm sorry, but are you sure you're not going the wrong way?" The question was gentle, but behind it was a layer of thought that anyone who had experienced it would understand. A question that sounded normal, but made the person's heart feel a little heavy. Damien took a slow breath. He took out his boarding pass. "It says it here," he replied, his voice even and calm. "Seat 1A. Karen looked at the ticket, or rather looked at it for less than a second, then put her hand down without bothering to scan it. She shook her head. "No. I don't have your name on the first-class list." Damien frowned slightly. "Have you checked?" Karen replied quickly. "I know for sure." "No, for sure. Just by a look." The moment made Damien pause. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't angry. He was just sad. A kind of sadness familiar to people who have been judged and not heard. He smiled slightly. A smile to try to avoid making the situation more tense. "Can you check the system? I bought the ticket 2 weeks ago." Karen crossed her arms over her chest. Her voice lowered. "Sir, I think you're in the wrong place. First class isn't for everyone." A light but sharp sentence. A sentence that was enough to make a few passengers behind him start to glance over. There was no malice in their eyes, only curiosity. But that curiosity made Damien feel a little pang in his heart. Have you ever had that moment? The moment when all eyes are on you, as if you were standing in a place you don't deserve to be. As if just because of your clothes you are out of place. If you have ever, you will understand how Damien felt in this moment. Karen turned slightly, signaling the next passenger to pass. But Damien stood there, not obstructing, not raising his voice, just standing there calm as one accustomed to storms. "I just want to get on the flight I paid for," he said, softly, just enough to be heard. Karen sighed, shaking her head. "Sir, please step aside so we can deal with the passenger in the back." Damien looked deep into her eyes, not in defiance, but as if asking something words couldn't express. Why? Why, just because of a normal outfit, just because he doesn't look like a first-class person, does he have to stand here explaining? But Damien didn't ask. He just took a step back, his heart constricting slightly. At that distance, he clearly heard a whisper from the next customer. "Maybe he really went the wrong way," someone else said in a lower voice. "You don't look like someone sitting in first class." Karen pursed her lips and repeated, "Sir, please stand aside." And Damien stood aside, calm, without resentment. But there was something tired in his eyes. "If you're here, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had someone judge you based on a single glance? Has anyone ever made you doubt your worth because they didn't think you fit somewhere? If so, maybe this story will resonate with you a little more. If not, maybe today you will understand why so many people are silent." But the story doesn't end there, because in just a few minutes, the entire flight will reverse. And Karen Mitchell will wish she had taken a closer look at that boarding pass. If anyone had just looked at Damien standing back, letting the passengers behind him pass through the first-class gates, they might have thought he was being too patient. But that was not the case. It was not weakness. It was a kind of strength, a strength forged over years of standing in the shadows of his own life. Damien stood there, silent amid the moving crowd. The sounds of the airport, the rolling of suitcases, the hurried calls, the loud announcements faded away. Only a distant echo echoed in his mind. An old memory, an old wound, an old saying. "This place is not for you." It was a phrase Damien first heard when he was 24, fresh out of his MBA, and applying to a small airline company. He wore a cheap shirt and leather shoes with one heel peeled off. He carried the hope, the seriousness, and the smile of a young man who believed he could go far with hard work. But the interviewer only glanced at him for 3 seconds, then pushed the file back onto the table. "You don't fit the bill. Not the image we're looking for." Damien remembered the moment. He remembered standing up, bowing his head in thanks, and walking out. No anger, no questioning, just an emptiness inside. It was also the first time he understood that sometimes the pain doesn't come from the words, but from how people say them and how they look at you. Now, when Karen says he doesn't belong in first class, it's like turning back the clock. But unlike the 4-year-old Damien, he has learned to stand up to the judgmental gaze. He looked down at his hands, strong hands that had signed hundreds of contracts, that had saved a company during a crisis. Hands that had overcome hardship to reach a position no one thought he could ever dream of. He smiled faintly, a smile that only the most tested of men could produce. Karen continued boarding first-class passengers. Her confident demeanor was backed by the authority of her title, lead flight attendant. But to Damien, that authority was as fragile as paper. A middle-aged man passed by carrying a briefcase, stopped to look at Damien for a second, then asked quietly, "Are you at the wrong gate? This is first class." He meant no harm. The question was a reflex of a society accustomed to judging people by their appearance. But it still made Damien close his eyes a little. He replied in a soft voice, "I know. I fly first class too." The man paused, then nodded and continued walking. Not everyone intentionally causes pain, but not all pain needs to be intentional to reach people. Meanwhile, Karen turned back, calling out in a sharper voice, "Sir, I told you you can't stand in this area. Please wait for regular boarding." Damien opened his eyes, looking at her calmly but deeply. "Have you checked the system?" It seemed like a simple question, but to Karen it felt like a challenge. She immediately frowned. "You think I don't know how to do my job?" Damien shook his head. "I just want you to double-check." Karen sighed, as if facing a difficult customer. "Sir, you are slowing down our progress." progress. Maybe that was always the problem with large systems. People prioritize process over people. Damien knew it better than anyone. He had fought to fix it. And today, it was right in front of him. Another group of passengers passed by glancing at Damien. A middle-aged woman whispered to her husband, "He doesn't look like a first-class person." Damien heard. Not because they spoke loudly, but because when people are accustomed to pain, their ears tend to be more sensitive to careless words. He didn't turn around. He didn't say anything. He just tightened his grip on his backpack strap as if to reassure himself. The sight of him standing there, tall, calm, but with a slight gap in his eyes, conveyed something very human to those who looked closely. A proud endurance. A breathless calm. Nearby, Lucy, a trainee flight attendant, saw the whole thing. She was only 26 years old. Her gentle face and eyes always had a bit of confusion typical of those new to the job. Lucy tilted her head to look at Damien one more time, then looked at the tablet near the boarding gate. On the screen, she still saw the name Damien Cole, Seat 1A, first class displayed in green. Clear as day. Unmistakable. Lucy's heart beat faster. She was embarrassed and moved a little closer to Karen, but she didn't dare say anything. In this working environment, saying the wrong thing could cause an intern like her to be poorly evaluated. But ignoring this also kept her from sleeping. She looked at Damien again. His features were calm, but his eyes were deep as the sea before a storm. Lucy took a deep breath. Then she backed away. She didn't have enough courage at that moment. But that wrong feeling planted a seed in her heart. Damien sensed someone watching him. He turned his head slightly and saw Lucy. She quickly looked down, pretending to check her tablet. Damien didn't know why he smiled at her. Perhaps it was because in that moment, amid the wary, suspicious looks, he sensed another look, a look that didn't judge, a look that reminded him of his mother. His mother once taught him, "You can't control other people's eyes, but you can choose how you react." Damien nodded slightly. It was a silent thank you to Lucy, though she had no idea what he was thinking. But that silence did not last long. Karen approached her face, no longer as patient as before. "Sir, this is the last time. You can't stand here anymore." Damien looked straight into her eyes, this time his voice low but not stiff. "I just want to be treated properly for the ticket I paid for." Karen let out a short, sarcastic laugh. "If you actually paid for seat 1A, the system would have displayed your name." Little did she know that at that moment, Lucy was standing just a few steps away from them, staring at the tablet screen that clearly displayed his name. No one knows. No one but Lucy. No one knows that the truth is right in front of them, but everyone believes what they want to believe. And Damien, even though he didn't know how the truth was being distorted, he could feel one thing: today was not like the previous times. Today, something is quietly telling me that this will be more than just a flight. This will be a test. For him, for them, for a system that has long forgotten that human beings deserve respect. And he thought to himself, "I can't stay silent forever." In the following minutes, the atmosphere at Gate C17 became strange. Not chaotic, not noisy, but a kind of stifling silence, as if everything was waiting for something. Something that no one could name but made people standing nearby feel a chill down their spines. Damien stood there a step back so as not to block anyone's path. He didn't want to cause trouble. He never did. But the way Karen looked at him, the way she glanced at him, as if he were someone up to something, he had to swallow hard to keep his voice from shaking. Karen called out to Tom, who had just returned from assisting another passenger. "Tom, check my first-class manifest again. I think there's an error." Tom glanced at Damien for a second. The corner of his lips curled up. What error? An error like someone who shouldn't be here is standing here. Damien heard every word. He blinked, not from anger, but from the weariness that was beginning to weigh heavily on his chest. No one likes to be looked down on. But to be looked down on in front of so many people is another challenge. Tom pulled the tablet from Karen's hand, quickly scanned the passenger list, then immediately shook his head. "No, I don't see the name Cole anywhere." Damien breathed a sigh of relief. He knew he had bought a ticket. He knew the code had been green when he checked in. But he also knew one thing: when people believe what they want to believe, the truth can sometimes be obscured with a shake of the head. Karen folded her arms and turned to face him. "Sir, I will repeat it again. Your name is not on the first-class list." Therefore, you cannot stand in this aisle." There was no politeness in her voice, no apology, no hesitation, just the certainty of someone who was absolutely right. Damien opened his wallet and took out his ID. He handed it to Karen with both hands, a sign of respect even though he was the one being insulted. "Here is my ID. You can check it again." Karen didn't take it, didn't touch it, just waved her hand lightly as if to chase away something unnecessary. "ID is irrelevant. I checked the list." Damien still held the ID in his hand, tilting his head slightly. "But you just asked Tom to check, and it only took him 3 seconds to look." "You could," Karen interrupted. "Sir, I've said enough." A few people behind gasped. A few turned away in embarrassment. Lucy swallowed in the far corner. She looked at her tablet, where Damien Cole's name was still displayed in the front row seat 1A in perfect green. She trembled slightly. She wanted to say it so much that her chest ached, but she still did not dare. Not because she wasn't brave enough, but because she knew that if she said the wrong thing, if Karen reported her for unauthorized interference, her fledgling career could end right here at the boarding gate. Karen reached out and snatched the paper boarding pass from Damien's hand. The paper was a little wrinkled from having held it all morning. But that wasn't what bothered Karen. She looked at the ticket and, without thinking, tore it in half. The sound of tearing paper was faint, but to Damien's ears, it sounded like someone closing a window in his face. Karen said, "Now, it's done. You don't have a boarding pass to mess with. No more boarding pass. No more paper evidence." Just the e-ticket on her phone, the thing Karen had refused to look at in the first place. Damien felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't because the ticket had been torn. He could reprint it. He could buy it again if he needed to. But the way Karen did it, the way she used the small power she had to make him look wrong, made him feel a deep sadness spread through his chest. Damien inhaled and said very softly, "Why didn't you check before tearing it?" Karen shrugged. "No need. I know for sure you're not on the list." A woman standing behind Damien whispered, Something is not right." The man with her nodded. "That's not fair at all." For the first time, someone spoke up for Damien. But Karen just rolled her eyes. "Please move so we can continue boarding." Tom crossed his arms, looking at Damien with a hint of triumph in his eyes. "Sir, I suggest you return to the economy zone to deal with this matter. Standing here will only complicate things." Damien turned to Tom, his voice not high, not sharp, but enough to make Tom slightly startled. "I didn't mess anything up. I just stood where my ticket allowed me to." Tom laughed. "Where do you get your ticket?" A sentence that made a few people behind grimace in discomfort. But no one had the courage to say it out loud. In the corner, Lucy suddenly turned on the recorder. Not to fight anyone. Not because she wanted to be a hero. But because in this moment, she felt that if she didn't do anything, she would carry that guilt with her for the rest of her life. She looked at Damien. He had no idea that someone was standing by his side in silence. Or maybe he did. The way he held himself, the way he placed his hand on the strap of his backpack, so gently it seemed as if he were comforting himself. Lucy understood that he had been through this more than once. A moment later, Karen turned to Tom. "Call Captain Reynolds down. I want to finish this before boarding closes." Damien heard that and bowed his head slightly. He knew things were about to get different. When a captain has to go down to the cabin to take care of a passenger, things usually don't go well. But he remained still, remained calm, still kept his eyes straight, unyielding, unconvincing. Lucy felt a pang in her heart when she saw this. She didn't know who this man was. But one thing was for sure, he didn't deserve to be treated like this. And then, amid the tension in the air, Damien spoke softly, as if to himself, "I've had enough." No one heard clearly. But that word so quiet was a sign that the storm was coming. Not the storm Damien created, but the storm the truth will bring. The air around Gate C17 seemed to stand still. No one spoke loudly, nor did anyone make any particular noise. But something was changing. A strange silence was spreading through the people waiting. Little did Damien know that a few rows behind him eyes were beginning to see things differently. No longer just a troublesome passenger. No longer a person standing in the wrong way. But a man being treated wrongly. A blonde woman in her mid-40s. Grace Miller gently pulled out her phone. Not to record, but to jot down her feelings. She was a content writer, and the habit of documenting injustice was instinctive for someone who had witnessed discrimination against her husband at work. She whispered to her husband, "You see, that man never raised his voice." Her husband Mark nodded, "I saw it." But the way the flight attendant tore the ticket, it was not right at all. The two men did not know Damien, but the way he stood there, back straight, eyes calm but sad, made them sense the truth before they knew the full story. Not far away, old Richard Wilson, who would later play an important role, was sitting in a chair outside the boarding area. He adjusted his glasses, looked at Damien for a long moment, then nodded slightly as if to confirm something. Richard has been flying for over 40 years, many airlines, many routes, many countries. He is used to seeing people's faces when they lie, and used to seeing the well-hidden despair in the eyes of those who have been wronged. The old man whispered. The man was telling the truth. I knew it, but Richard remained seated. Age had taught him that standing up at the right time was more important than standing up first. As for Lucy, she stood just a few steps away from Damien, and at this moment her mood was the most chaotic. Her heart beat fast, each beat like an urge. Speak. Speak the truth. His name is still in the system. They're wrong. But reason held her back. If I say the wrong procedure, if Karen reports it to the supervisor, I could lose my training program. I worked too hard to get this position. Between those two opposing thoughts, Lucy felt her hands trembling. She looked at Damien again. He was still standing there, calm, patient, but his eyes had a look of something that was slowly being pushed to the limit. Lucy bit her lip. There are moments in life when you don't have much time to think, only a few seconds to decide who you will become. And Lucy was standing in the middle of that moment. Karen, not realizing the change in the atmosphere, kept her voice cold. Tom, where is Captain Reynolds? I want this taken care of right away. Tom looked at his watch. He is on his way down. Karen took a deep breath, then said in an authoritative voice, Sir, you've taken up a lot of our time, and if you still don't move, we'll have to call security. Some of the passengers in the back shuddered. Security. It always carries a sense of risk and danger, even if the situation may not be that dire. Damien looked at Karen for a long time before answering. His voice was low, deep, and calm as autumn water. I did nothing wrong. Karen replied. Your name is not on the list. Damien exhaled slow and heavy. Have you checked? Karen was frustrated. I told you I know for sure. Lucy swallowed. In the words, I know for sure, she heard stubbornness more than truth. In the back row, a woman exclaimed, How can they know for sure without testing anything? Another man said, That young girl over there, who seems to be looking at the tablet, definitely saw something, Lucy heard. Her hands clenched. Her silence was publicly humiliating a man, and she couldn't take it much longer. At that moment, Captain Reynolds appeared. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face marked by more than 2 decades of piloting. He walked forward with the authoritative air of someone used to handling trouble. Karen and Tom immediately straightened, as if empowered. What's going on here? Reynolds asked firmly. Karen quickly, Captain, this passenger claims to be first class, but his name is not on the manifest. I have torn up his fake boarding pass. Reynolds turned to Damien. His gaze was not hostile, but there was a hint of suspicion, a natural habit when faced with an uncertain situation. Sir, I want you to explain. Damien inhaled, keeping his voice gentle. I had a first-class ticket. I checked in early. My ticket was torn without being checked. Reynolds frowned. Do you have proof? Damien held up the phone. I have an e-ticket. Karen immediately interjected. Captain, anyone can forge an e-ticket. That statement made several people standing nearby let out a loud, annoyed sigh. Grace whispered. That being said, any passenger could be considered a fake. Reynolds said nothing. He reached out to take the phone to look, but Karen took a half step forward and whispered, Captain, we don't have time. The cabin is waiting. Security just needs to come up. Damien heard every word. Security. Done. He closed his eyes for a second. Over the years, the tense meetings, the big deals, the challenges he overcame, never made him feel as small as he did at this moment. Not because he was afraid, but because he was disappointed by the obvious injustice, but no one stood up until Lucy's voice rang out. Shaky but clear, Captain, I want to say this. Karen turned around Lucy. What are you doing? Lucy instinctively took a step back, but then took a deep breath. I checked my tablet just now. His ticket was green. His name was on the first-class list. Seat 1A. The whole boarding area shook for a second. Karen glared. "What did you just say?" Lucy replied, this time more firmly. "His name was in the system. I saw it. There was no mistake." Reynolds quay saying Karen. "You said you don't have a name," Karen stammered. I'm sure I didn't see." Grace burst out. "You don't see or you don't want to see," Karen blushed. Tom stepped up and growled. "Lucy, this is not your responsibility. Don't interfere." But Lucy shook her head. "I cannot remain silent when the truth is being ignored." Damien looked at her, his eyes softening slightly. In that moment, he saw himself from many years ago, the one who wanted to speak up for himself but wasn't strong enough. Now, a young girl is doing what he wished someone would do for him. Reynolds turned to Karen, his voice stern. "Did you tear up your boarding pass without checking it?" Karen swallowed. I thought. Reynolds repeated, his voice colder. "You tore up the ticket because you thought it was me." No one said anything. No one dared. In that silence, Damien slowly said, "I'm not asking for special privileges. I just want to be treated like a human being." A very light sentence. But it seemed to pour into the hearts of all those standing there a deep sadness. Richard Wilson stood up from his chair, leaning on his cane, and walked forward. "Captain, I have been flying for over 40 years. I have never seen a passenger as calm as he is when being treated like that. If the system calls his name, then it is not his fault." Reynolds closed his eyes for a second. He knew what he had to do next. But he also knew that Karen and Tom had made a terrible mistake. Lucy stood there, her heart pounding, but for the first time, she didn't feel scared. Maybe because she knew she was on the right side of the truth. Maybe because she saw an unspoken thank you in Damien's eyes. And Karen, she looked at Lucy, then at Damien, then at Reynolds. The control she had once felt so confident in was slipping away. And that's just the beginning. Captain Reynolds stood still for a few seconds that felt like a minute. No one, not even Karen or Tom, dared to breathe in that moment. The air in Gate C17 was thick, as if the entire terminal was being pulled into a vacuum where all sound was drowned out. Reynolds turned to look at each of them, in turn Karen, Tom, and finally Lucy. His gaze lingered longest on Lucy, the young apprentice who had just dared to say what everyone else had avoided. "Lucy," he said slowly, "are you sure you definitely saw his name in the system?" Lucy took a deep breath. Her throat was dry with tension, but her voice was clear. "Yes, definitely. I saw his name in seat 1A, the blue one. I checked it twice." Karen immediately interrupted, her voice almost out of control. "Captain, she's just a trainee. She doesn't understand how manifests work." Maybe she saw wrong. Lucy turned to Karen, her eyes no longer filled with fear. "For the first time, I'm not seeing things. I know how to read manifests." Karen was stunned. Tom frowned, not believing that this little girl dared to confront the chief steward in front of the captain. Reynolds sighed. "Okay, let me check the system." He took the tablet from Karen's hand. Karen paused as if she wanted to keep it, but didn't dare. Reynolds ran his hand down the list, and then he stopped. He stared longingly at the top row, where it read Cole Damien. 1A, first class, confirmed. No one said anything. No one dared. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. Tom frowned, moved closer to look, then suddenly stood up straight as if electrocuted. Grace, the woman standing behind, whispered, "Oh my God, so his ticket was actually valid." Mark squeezed his wife's hand. "They tore up people's tickets without checking anything." The whole boarding area began to stir. Sighs and slight grunting of annoyance at Karen and Tom's behavior spread out in small waves. Damien stood still, not winning, not losing, just still. His eyes were as calm as a winter lake. Reynolds turned to Karen, his voice low but heavy as metal. "Did you confirm you checked the manifest before tearing the ticket?" Karen swallowed hard, her face red. I thought." "No," Reynolds interrupted. "You can't assume. You have to check. This isn't a random process." Tom jumped in to save Karen. "Captain, sometimes the system can glitch," Reynolds coldly. The system did not glitch in a way that caused exactly one first-class passenger to disappear, while all the information remained intact. Tom was silent. Karen tried to say, but his attitude, Damien said softly, but clearly, "I only stood where my ticket allowed." Karen bowed her head, trembling slightly. Damien's words were not reproachful, Not harsh, not condemning. But it was that calmness that made her feel smaller than ever. Reynolds asked again, his voice as serious as a training session. Did either of you remove the passenger's name from the manifest? Karen turned pale. No, I didn't do anything. Tom also stammered. Me neither. I haven't touched the system. Lucy saw. It was the first time all morning that Lucy saw real fear in Karen and Tom's eyes. Not afraid of passengers. Not afraid of being sued. But afraid of the truth they are trying to cover up being revealed bit by bit. Reynolds Quay, saying, Damien, sir, I apologize for this incident. We will handle it internally. You may board the plane now. Damien looked straight at Reynolds. There was something different about his gaze, deeper, quieter, as if he were weighing every word. He didn't move. He didn't budge. He asked softly. Why? Reynolds was a little confused. What do you mean? Why do these two people think I can't sit in first class just because I'm wearing a hoodie? Why do they tear up my ticket without checking it? Why do they take it upon themselves to decide where I belong on this plane? No one answered. Damien continued, his voice not reproachful, but heavy with truth. If I looked like a rich person, if I wore a suit, had an expensive watch, would she tear up my ticket? Karen looked down. Tom avoided everyone's eyes. Grace in the back row spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. He was right. I saw it all from the beginning. No one asked him a single question before tearing up the ticket. Richard, the old man sitting nearby, leaned on his cane and stepped forward. Captain, I've been flying for years. I can assure you this passenger has never caused any trouble. It's all their fault. Reynolds took a deep breath. The pressure from the surrounding eyes seemed to be concentrated on him. Damien looked back at Lucy. The trainee felt a shiver run down her spine when his gaze met hers. Not from fear, but from the feeling that she was witnessing a man decide to stand up for all the times he had remained silent in the past. Damien said, thank you. If it weren't for you, I might have been forced to leave this area. Lucy shook her head. I just did the right thing. Damien smiled slightly. The right thing is sometimes the hardest thing to do. Lucy's eyes reddened. There was something in his voice that warmed her heart and also made her feel ashamed for waiting so long to speak. Reynolds stood still, saying nothing for several seconds. Then he turned to Karen and Tom. I will report this whole incident. You two are temporarily suspended from duty for today's flight. Karen jumped up. Captain, no fair. Reynolds raised his hand. No more words. Tom tried to keep calm. We just follow the procedure. No, Reynolds said bluntly. You two followed your prejudices, not the process. The whole boarding area echoed with whispers. Karen suddenly burst into tears, but stopped immediately out of embarrassment. Damien didn't look at her with triumph. He looked at her as if she were lost in her own arrogance. Reynolds turned to Damien again. Sir, I apologize on behalf of the crew. If you would like, I can take you to the plane right now with an escort. Damien shook his head slightly. I will go up, but not now. Reynolds frowned. What do you want? Damien looked at Karen and Tom, then at everyone standing at the gate. I want them to understand that their actions have consequences. I want the truth to be known. I want to know what happened to the manifest. The calmness in his voice almost made Karen collapse. Tom swallowed. He began to look around as if afraid someone would appear. Damien said the last thing. Soft but sharp as a knife, I will not be silent this time. No one knew what was going to happen in the next 20 minutes. No one knew who Damien Cole really was. No one knew that the little incident at Gate C17 was quietly spreading through the phones of passengers who had started recording as the truth began to emerge. Only one thing is clear. The old order has been shattered, and Damien has just taken the first step into a confrontation that no one expected would change the entire Skywave airline. After Captain Reynolds announced the temporary suspension of Karen and Tom, the space in front of Gate C17 suddenly fell silent for a long time. It was as if everyone had just witnessed a wall that had been built for a long time, just had its first crack. Damien stood in the dim light of the boarding gate, breathing softly but evenly. No one knew what he was thinking. No one knew why he looked so calm, especially after being so publicly humiliated. Reynolds looked at him. Sir, you can board the plane now. I'll make sure everything is taken care of. Damien nodded slightly, not with satisfaction, but with a nod of someone who was used to walking through hurt without letting it turn to anger. He put his backpack back on and walked slowly down the small path leading to the cabin. The passengers on both sides made way. No one said anything. But their eyes spoke for them. I saw it. I witnessed it. You are not alone. The lights in the first-class cabin were soft. The air was cool, filled with the scent of fresh linen and lightly roasted coffee from the front cabin's coffee machine. Damien walked in, and once again, that feeling came flooding back. It was a hard feeling to describe. When you walk into a place where you were supposed to belong but are forced to stand outside for too long. Several passengers on the plane looked at him strangely. Not because he was a stranger, but because they had just seen a short video someone had posted online a few minutes earlier of Karen tearing up her boarding pass. The spread was incredibly fast. A young man in a shirt whispered to his friend. It was him who was kicked out of the gate. His friend asked, "What did he do wrong?" The other person shook his head. "Nothing." After a few seconds of hesitation, Lucy followed Damien into the cabin. She wanted to make sure he didn't get into any more trouble. Trainees like her were usually confined to the galley, not allowed to enter first class when not on duty. But today, Lucy didn't care about that rule. She whispered, "Sir, if you need anything, just tell me." Damien turned back to look at her. His smile for Lucy was warm and soft like the afternoon sun shining through the window. "Thank you. Not everyone does the right thing when it's hard." Lucy blushed. "I just don't want injustice to happen to me." Damien nodded. "I understand. You just opened a door that many people have kept silent about for a long time." Lucy looked down, her hands clasped together, as if to reassure herself. But in her eyes, there was something stronger. Seat 1A was at the front of the cabin, right next to the large window. Damien put down his backpack and took a seat. He let out a breath, but it wasn't a breath of relief, it was a breath of preparation for something he couldn't quite define. That silence had fallen for less than 3 seconds. Then Tom appeared in the aisle. Despite being suspended, he remained in the cabin awaiting further instructions. His face was tense, trying to maintain his composure, but his shoulders were shaking slightly. "Sir," Tom said, trying to sound kind, "about what just happened. I hope you understand. We just want to make sure it's in order." Damien turned his head, looking at him slowly. "Procedure." Tom nodded vigorously. "Yes, first class has many cases of cheating. We have to be careful." Damien asked softly. "Careful or prejudice?" Tom opened his mouth but couldn't speak. Damien continued, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "If I had worn a suit, perhaps you wouldn't have suspected me. If I had worn an expensive watch, perhaps my ticket wouldn't have been torn." Tom swallowed. I don't," Damien whispered. "I don't want you to apologize. I just want you to be honest." Tom stood there for a few seconds, then bowed his head. I looked at the way you dressed, and I misjudged." Damien didn't answer, didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He just looked Tom straight in the eyes, making him see himself clearly. There are lessons that don't need to be scolded. They just need someone to look at you the right way. In the back seat, an elderly woman stood up and held onto the front seat. Her voice was soft but clear. "I'm sorry for listening all this time, but I think I have to say this." Damien turned back. A white woman with silver hair and kind, deep eyes. Her name was Evelyn Hart. Evelyn looked straight at Damien. "Years ago, my son was also kicked off a flight because they thought he didn't have enough money to buy a ticket. He was wearing a hoodie, just like you today." The whole cabin was silent. He didn't say anything, just quietly left the plane. And that night, he cried in his room. Not because the ticket was lost, but because he felt like he wasn't seen as a human being. Damien heard that, and something inside him softened. Evelyn continued. "I looked at him and saw the same look in his eyes as my son did that day. But he stood up. He didn't leave. I thank him for that." She put her hand on her heart. "If someone had stood up for my son that day, maybe it would have hurt less." The silence that followed Evelyn's words filled the cabin with a thin layer of tranquil smoke. Damien tilted his head slightly. "Thank you." Evelyn smiled. "No, thank you." Tom stood at the end of the aisle listening, and his face fell. Something in Evelyn's story struck a part of him that he had hidden behind a mask of indifference. Karen appeared outside the cabin door. Her eyes were red, her mascara was smeared, her hair was slightly disheveled. She no longer had the cold demeanor she had before. There was only the collapse of someone who realized she had gone too far, and there was no way back. She said softly, almost inaudibly, "Sir, I..." am sorry." Damien looked at her. Not angry, not cold, just tired and sad, as if he were looking at a familiar figure from the past. He replied, "I hope you learn from this." Karen burst into tears again. But this time, they were not tears of shame. They were tears of someone who finally saw herself in the mirror. Lucy stepped forward, placed her hand lightly on the door, and looked at Karen with a non-judgmental gaze. "You can do it again. Anyone can." Karen looked at Lucy as if looking at a small light at the end of a tunnel. Damien saw that scene and felt clearly. Even though he didn't come to change anyone, the truth always has its own power. Reynolds stepped out of the cockpit. "Passengers and crew, please note we will be taking off in a few minutes. The cabin is being rearranged." He looked at Damien. "Sir, once again my sincere apologies." Damien simply replied, "I hope this is the last time something like this happens." Reynolds nodded. "Last time?" When he returned to seat 1, Damien looked out the cabin window. The late afternoon light cast a warm golden glow across his face. And in that rare moment of peace, he knew this wasn't over. The gate incident was just a small spark. Something bigger was coming, because Damien hadn't revealed who he really was. And no one knew yet that Seat 1A belonged to the CEO of Skywave Airlines. A real storm is at the doorstep. The air in the first-class cabin was as still as a lake that had just stopped rippling. Damien sat still in Seat 1A, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, his eyes staring into the distance through the misty afternoon glass. From outside, the lights of Hudson International Airport's runway reflected long streaks of light like thoughts that had yet to find a way out. Even though the cabin had calmed down, no one was truly calm. Because their intuition told them this incident had only just begun. Lucy stood beside him, bent down and asked softly, "Sir, are you okay?" Damien smiled slightly. "I'm fine. I was just thinking, why does something as small as a ticket cause so many people to reveal their true nature?" Lucy listened to every word, then said softly, "There are things that seem small but touch the most painful spot." Damien nodded slightly. The girl was young, but more empathetic than many who had been in the profession for 10 years. At the back of the compartment, Tom stood still, as if someone had nailed his feet to the floor. He looked at Damien, then down at his hands. Hands that had torn up countless passenger tickets when he was suspicious but never thought he was wrong. Karen sat in the passenger seat, her hands shaking, her mascara streaking like a mistake. Gone was the coldness, gone was the arrogance. Just a woman realizing her entire career could be over this very afternoon. This silence, no one dares to break. Until Damien opened his eyes. He pulled out his phone and looked at the screen. A message popped up from someone no one on the plane expected. "Boardroom. Skywave Airlines ready when I give the signal." Damien let out a sigh. Few people knew that he was not only the CEO, he was also one of Skywave's largest shareholders. He had direct influence on all senior personnel decisions, but he didn't want to press the final button yet. Not yet. Lucy asked hesitantly, "Sir, are you going to reveal your true identity?" Damien tilted his head to look at her. "Do you think it is necessary?" Lucy hesitated for a few seconds, then replied, "If it were me, I would want them to understand how wrong they were. Not because you're the CEO, but because you're human." Damien smiled slightly. "Your advice is valuable." Suddenly, from the end of the cabin, a voice rang out strong, but not tense. "Mr. Cole." Damien turned. A tall man in a navy blue suit stepped out from the aisle. It was Jonathan Reed, a prominent tech investor who happened to be on the flight. Jonathan approached. "I recognize you." Damien Cole, Skywave Airlines. The whole cabin was silent. Karen was so startled that she almost stood up. Tom took a step back, his mouth open and silent. Lucy looked at Jonathan, then at Damien, her eyes filled with surprise. "Are you the CEO of Skywave?" Damien stopped dodging. He stood up, slightly adjusted his simple coat, and spoke clearly. "Yes, I'm Damien Cole." Not a breath in the cabin was easy. Everything seemed to be sucked back into the chest, compressed into a suffocating ball. Jonathan smiled faintly. "I saw the video at the gate. It's unbelievable that airline staff would treat the CEO of a partner airline like that." Damien replied simply, "They don't need to know who I am to treat me properly. They just need to know I'm a passenger." "A male passenger," in row 2B whispered loudly. He was right. They were wrong. From the moment they tore up that ticket. Another woman whispered, "Oh my God, they hit on the right person." Karen heard every word like a knife cutting through the last layer of clothing she was trying to cling to. Captain Reynolds stepped quickly from the cockpit when he heard the commotion. "What's up?" Lucy looked at him and said, "Captain, Mr. Cole is the CEO of Skywave." Reynolds stood still. His expression morphed from surprise to seriousness to a regret he never thought he would have to display here. He looked at Damien, bowing his head slightly. "I don't know, sir." Damien replied, "I don't need you to know. I just need you to behave." Reynolds nodded vigorously. "And I will." Karen stood up and walked over, her voice almost breaking. "Sir, I don't know. If I had known, I wouldn't have." Damien raised his hand slightly, interrupting, but not rudely. "You're wrong again, Karen. The problem isn't that you don't know I'm the CEO. It's that you think only people with status deserve respect." Karen stepped back, her face pale. Damien continued, "If a normal person sat in this seat, they probably would have been thrown off the plane." The cabin was silent. Tom swallowed and tried to say, "Sir, I was wrong. I'm honest. But please give me a chance to make it right." Damien looked at him for a long time. So long that Tom couldn't stand the look and had to look away. Finally, Damien said, "I don't make decisions right away. Not when I'm angry, but what happens today will be recorded in full." Tom nodded vigorously, like a drowning man who has just grabbed a plank. Jonathan looked at Damien, then said softly, "If you want, I can testify. I saw the whole thing at the gate." Damien smiled softly. "Thank you, but no need, because everyone here has seen." He glanced around the cabin. A dozen pairs of eyes looked back at him, not with admiration for power, but with respect for someone who had the courage to face injustice without making a fuss, without shouting, without losing his temper. It is the composure of someone who has gone through much pain without letting it distort his soul. A little girl about 8 years old, sitting by the window in row 3, stood up and quietly ran over. She held in her hand a napkin with a heart drawn on it and a scribbled message. "You deserve your seat. You deserve your seat." Damien sat down at her level and gently took the paper. "Thank you, sweetie." The girl smiled brightly. "My dad said, everyone should be respected, no matter what they wear." Damien looked at the man, the girl's father, sitting in row 3A. He nodded. "I teach my children that. Because the world needs more people who believe that." Damien felt his heart stop, not because of sadness, but because of touch. Lucy approached and whispered, "Sir, do you want me to inform the ground crew to prepare for a meeting?" Damien thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Not yet. Let them see the consequences for themselves first." Lucy nodded. The cabin fell silent again. But this time, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was like a layer of air had stopped to witness the moment of transformation of everyone present today. This wasn't just a passenger being insulted. It wasn't just a flight attendant being angry. It wasn't just a male flight attendant being negligent. This is the moment when a large mirror is placed in the middle of the cabin, and each person has to look at themselves. Damien sat back down in seat 1A. He looked out the window. His eyes were deeper, farther, because in this moment he knew very clearly a real dialogue with Skywave management will take place. A wave of change will be initiated, not just to fix some flaws in the process, but to reiterate something seemingly simple. No one has to deserve respect. They are respected because they are human, and today's story has just entered its most important chapter. The first-class cabin remained strangely silent. It was neither comfortable nor scary, but rather like the silence before a very large door opened. Damien sat back in seat 1, tucking the napkin the girl had given him into his pocket. He kept it carefully as a reminder that kindness comes from the most unexpected places, and that those little acts of kindness sometimes have more power than a CEO title. Lucy stood a few feet away, looking at him with a mixture of worry and admiration. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew for sure nothing would be the same again. Damien's phone rang, a video call. From the boardroom, Skywave Airlines. He glanced at the cabin. Everyone was silent, as if they understood that the call wasn't just for Damien, but for everyone watching the truth unfold. He clicked, accept. The screen showed 3 familiar faces: Ethan Gray, chairman of the board; Marissa Lee, senior director of human resources; David Langford, director of network operations. Ethan spoke first. "Damien, We've seen the preliminary report. Both video and audio from Gate C17. Are you okay? Damien replied calmly. I'm fine, but the company is not. Tom, at the back of the compartment, gulped when he heard that. Karen bowed her head so low she didn't dare look up. Marissa looked into the camera, her sharp eyes reading every breath in the cabin. Damien, we can confirm your ticket is valid. The system clearly shows seat 1A. Who edited the log? Damien tilted his head toward Karen. No need to point. No need to name. The whole cabin understood. Karen was shaking so hard that the small name tag on her shirt shook with each breath. Damien replied, Karen Mitchell is the log editor, and Tom Harris is the support. Tom took a deep breath, his lips trembling slightly. Sir, I was just following. Damien raised his hand gently, but firmly. I'll talk to you later. When things are clearer. Tom bit his lip and stepped back. David spoke, his voice like metal clanging. Damien, if what we heard is true, this wouldn't be the first time. Damien looked up. What do you mean? David opened a file on his screen. It contained 3 passenger complaint reports from different Skywave flights, and all 3 had one thing in common. Black passengers were suspected of being not first class. Their seat logs were altered, and their tickets were withheld or refused. Lucy let out a gasp. Damien felt his chest tighten. Ethan said slowly, and, in every single case, the name that came up in the shift responsibilities was Karen Mitchell. The whole cabin was stunned. Karen took a step back. No, it's not me. Not entirely. Sometimes it's a system error. Sometimes. David interrupted, his voice sharp. There are recordings, internal reports, new employee statements. Lucy flinched at the word new employee. She looked down at her hand, clutching the phone. She understood her recording had become evidence. Karen looked at Lucy, her eyes desperate. You dare report me? Lucy did not avoid it. She looked straight into those trembling eyes. I choose fairness, not sides. Karen almost collapsed into her chair. Damien took a deep breath. He wasn't happy, nor was he gloating. He was sad. So sad the whole cabin felt it. He looked at the screen. Ethan, if this is a flawed system, it's not just one person's fault. We have to fix it from the root. Ethan nodded. We are waiting for your signal. Damien was silent for a few seconds. The whole cabin held its breath. Then he said, conduct a full investigation. From training background to seat allocation process to personal responsibility. Anyone who ever edited the wrong log, fired immediately. Anyone who knew and kept quiet, suspended. Karen burst into tears. Tom stood stiffly. Lucy bowed her head, tears falling from both relief and pressure. Ethan asked, what about the people in the cabin? What do you want to do? Damien scanned the cabin. He missed no one. The little girl, the old man, the brave ones who had just spoken up, the silent observers. Then he replied, I want them to get a formal apology. And I want people to look back at this not with fear, but with hope that we can change. Jonathan, in the back seat, nodded vigorously. I will testify to any proceedings that are necessary. Damien smiled. Thank you. Marissa asked again. What about the staff? How do you want to handle it? Damien looked at Karen first. I don't want to take away anyone's livelihood if they're willing to change. But Karen, it's not the first time you've done this. Karen hiccuped. I was wrong. But I didn't mean to. I just did what I thought was right for the airline's image. Damien shook his head. Image is not what makes a company moral. How you treat others is the real image of a company. Karen burst into tears, covering her face. Damien turned to Tom. You have a chance to make things right. But that chance is not today. You are suspended pending reevaluation. Tom nodded, his eyes red. And then he looked at Lucy. She stood straight, her hands clasped together, but her eyes did not retreat. Damien said she did what not many people dare. She recorded the truth. She did not choose silence. Lucy bit her lip and replied softly, I just did the right thing I could do. Damien smiled slightly. And the company needs more of them. After this flight, I recommend a temporary promotion for you. Assist the internal investigation team. Lucy opened her eyes wide. You, Damien nodded. You deserve it. The passengers applauded spontaneously. Not loudly, but sincerely. Ethan, said Damien. "We need confirmation. Do you want to hold a press conference tonight?" Damien looked out the window. The runway lights stretched out like endless thoughts. He said, "No. Let's let the facts speak for us tonight. We'll have a press conference when everything is clear. I don't want to fuss. I want change." One sentence warmed the whole cabin. Ethan nodded vigorously. "I understand. Your signal is clear. Damien, you have full authority on the scene." Damien bowed his head. The call ended, leaving a black screen reflecting his strangely calm face. A man who was looked down upon this afternoon. Yet he sat here, without losing his dignity. What he lost was faith in a system he helped build. And what he's trying to get back is justice for people who suffered the same fate as him, even without the CEO title to protect them. Lucy approached and whispered, "Sir, would you like to take a break?" Damien looked at her, his eyes filled with fatigue, but he did not collapse. "No, this flight still has to take off." But this time, with proper respect. The cabin was quiet again, as quiet as the moment after a storm has passed, leaving the sky clear for new beginnings. In the first-class cabin, the soft yellow light illuminated each face. Damien leaned back in seat 1, closing his eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to keep his mind from being pulled back into memories he had buried for so long. The sound of ground crew wheels drifted in from outside, distant, but enough to remind them the flight hadn't taken off yet. No one in the cabin complained. No one seemed upset. They all understood what lay ahead was more important than any destination. Lucy stood next to seat 1, looking at him with concern. She noticed Damien's silence was unusually long, not like the calm, strong demeanor he usually displayed. More like the silence of someone struggling with old, unhealed wounds. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked softly. Damien opened his eyes and looked out the window. The runway stretched out like a silent memory before his eyes. He spoke softly but deeply. "There are things, even though it's been 20 years, it still feels like yesterday." Lucy didn't understand everything, but she was tactful enough not to ask further. She just stood there like a small support. In the row against the wall in front of the cabin, Karen sat as still as a forgotten statue. Her eyes were red and sunken, as if the world had just drained the life from her body. She no longer had the arrogance, no longer had the cold demeanor, only fear and remorse that touched the bottom of her heart. She stole a glance at Damien, but bowed her head immediately, as if his eyes were a mirror she couldn't bear to face. Captain Reynolds stepped out of the cockpit. He looked around the cabin, then spoke softly but clearly. "We will be on hold for a few more minutes. Internal checks are underway." No one responded. Instead, a middle-aged woman spoke loudly. "Captain, do what must be done. We can wait." Reynolds nodded gratefully. He had never seen a cabin so calm in a situation like this. Tom stood a few paces away, his hands clasped together, his eyes troubled. He approached Damien, hesitating with each step. "Sir," his voice trembled, "I would like to say a few words." Damien did not turn his head, but he said, "Just say it." Tom took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice from breaking. "I was wrong, but I don't just want to apologize. I want to tell you why." Damien turned his eyes, not angry, not contemptuous, just the eyes of someone who was listening with all his heart. Tom continued, "I grew up in a neighborhood where we were taught to be wary. That some people who don't fit in are going to cause trouble." He stopped clasping his hands. "I carried that prejudice into adulthood without realizing it was wrong. Until today." Damien asked, "Did today make you realize?" Tom looked down at the floor, then nodded sharply. The nod of a man finally seeing the darkness within himself. "Because today, I saw that I had hurt someone who was not wrong, and I saw that pain right in front of me. It was no longer a newspaper story. It was real." Damien looked at Tom for a long time. Then he said, "You can retake the course. The important thing is that you dare to look at your mistakes." Tom exhaled as lightly as if he had just put down the stone he had carried on his shoulder for so many years. All eyes in the cabin turned to Karen. She still did not stand up, but then, as if something inside her had truly broken, Karen stepped closer to Damien. One step at a time, slow and heavy, as if each step were a confession. She stood before him. "Sir," her voice was hoarse, "if you allow me, I want to make everything clear. Damien said nothing. He waited. Karen took a deep breath, her hands shaking so much she had to grip her skirt to keep herself steady. I was underestimated, had my appearance criticized, and was looked down upon when I first started my career. I thought, if I acted powerful, if I was strict, no one would look down on me anymore. She forced a smile, tears rolling down her face, but it turned out I became the person I was most afraid of. Damien looked at her, his voice low but not cold. When people are hurt and don't heal, they are more likely to hurt others. Karen burst into tears, bowing her head. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Not because you're the CEO, but because you shouldn't have to suffer like that. No one should have to suffer like that. The moment brought a dead silence to the cabin. Some wiped away tears. Some exhaled, as if releasing something pent up. Damien placed his hands on the arms of his chair. His voice was low, even, but full of sternness. Karen, look straight at me. She looked up, her eyes red with pure fear. Damien said, Today is not the end of your career. It is a chance to start over. But starting over must start with admitting your mistakes and correcting them. Karen hiccuped, I will. I swear. Damien nodded slightly. I hope you keep your word. A soft sigh came from the back seat. Not of disappointment, but of relief. An elderly male passenger, Richard Wilson, stood up. He leaned his hands on the armrests of his chair, his voice warm and slow. I've seen it all along. I've been a victim of prejudice and a bearer of prejudice. Today, I see a whole circle of life in this little moment. He looked at Damien. You kept your composure when many people couldn't. And thanks to that, we have a chance to be honest with each other. Damien responded with a small, respectful bow. Lucy stepped closer to Damien and whispered, Sir, would you like the cabin to remain silent for a few more minutes? Damien looked around. Everyone was still looking to him as the anchor of the moment. But he didn't want the tension to stay that way. He said softly, No need. Let's give them a breather. Everyone is stressed enough. Lucy nodded, smiling slightly. Damien leaned his head back, his eyes staring at the cabin ceiling. His breath came out slowly. Then, he closed his eyes, and his memories rushed back like a flood. He saw himself at 19 being refused service at a store just because he was wearing a hoodie. He saw himself at 25 going to an interview with a carefully prepared resume. But the recruiter just said, We are looking for a more suitable image. He found himself at the age of 32 stopped by a security guard at a five-star hotel and asked, Who are you delivering to? Those words, each sentence, each moment, accumulated into a pain that today Karen accidentally rekindled. With a small action, like tearing up the ticket. But Damien didn't let it turn into anger. He let it turn into strength. Lucy stood next to seat 1. Looked at him and asked softly, Sir, you have been through this. Many times Damien opened his eyes. He did not respond verbally, just a sad smile tugging at the corner of his lips. A smile that says it all. Lucy clenched her hands as if to fight for him against the world. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his voice clearer than before. We have about 10 minutes before the initial internal investigation is complete. If you have anything to say, the cabin is listening. Damien stood up. Don't raise your voice. Don't make a scene. Don't pick on anyone's mistakes. Just speak from the heart. I don't want anyone to have to experience the feeling of being looked down upon, judged, seen as not belonging, just because of the way they look, the color of their skin, or because of the silence of a system. He looked at Karen. He looked at Tom. He looked at each passenger. What happened today hurts, but sometimes it takes pain to see the wound. And then we can begin to heal it. No one in the cabin breathed heavily. Damien bowed his head, I hope. This is the beginning of change. A round of applause broke out. Not loud, but genuine. Like the sound of many hearts beating as one. The first-class cabin fell into a long silence after Damien finished speaking. The air was calm, but the energy swirling beneath the calm, everyone could feel it. It was as if what had just happened was not limited to seat 1, not just that afternoon at Hudson International, but was spreading throughout the entire Skywave Airlines system. Suddenly, Damien's phone vibrated. An internal message appeared on the screen. Initial report, 12 incorrect log edits in 18 months, most involving Karen's team. Damien squeezed the phone, not out of anger, but because it felt like someone was digging into an old scar he'd tried to forget. Lucy stood to his right, reading the slight tension on Damien's face. "Sir, is something wrong?" Damien didn't answer right away. He just put the phone down on the small table beside his chair and looked out the window. The afternoon light fell on the runway, spreading out in an endless golden strip like an old memory being awakened. He said slowly, "Not the first time. Not just today. Not just with me." Lucy swallowed, sensing a deeper story coming. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his voice low but clear. "Mr. Cole, the internal investigation is expanding. It seems the matter is larger than we thought." Damien nodded, not surprised. "I guess so. A behavior never exists in isolation. It is often rooted in culture." Reynolds sighed. "I apologize on behalf of the system I belong to." Damien looked at him, his eyes not blaming. "You are not the system, but you are responsible for changing it." Reynolds bowed his head. A man accustomed to commanding suddenly felt small, realizing he had not been looking closely enough at his position. In the front row, Richard Wilson looked at Damien for a long time. The old man seemed to understand more than Damien said. Richard spoke. "You talk like someone who has witnessed this too many times." Damien turned his eyes downcast. And then, for the first time since the beginning of the flight, he shared not with the cabin, but with himself. "When I was 16, my father was refused boarding. He was wearing his factory uniform after work. They said he was standing in the wrong row, even though he had bought the same class ticket as everyone else." Damien paused, taking a deep breath. Lucy reached out and gently gripped the back of the seat in front of her. Her heart tightening, Damien continued, "That night my father said to me, 'You have to be twice as good as others for them to believe you are worthy.' And that saying stuck with me for the rest of my life." Richard looked down, his lips pressed together as if to hold back sympathetic pain. Damien continued, his voice as quiet as a wound that never healed. "I worked like crazy. I became an aerospace engineer, then a manager, then a CEO. But every time I dressed casually, or every time I let my appearance be comfortable, I still got asked questions that other people never get asked." Lucy felt her heart heavy as a stone. Tom stood nearby, pale. He had never heard anyone speak of pain so closely. Karen put her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back a sob. Damien said, "Today, when you tore up my ticket, Karen, I saw my father standing at the boarding gate 20 years ago. They said he didn't fit in that seat. Just like you told me." Karen couldn't stand it anymore. She burst into tears, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Damien didn't look at her accusingly. He was just releasing the pain he had held in for too long. While the cabin was still filled with emotion, Damien's phone vibrated again. A message from David Langford video at Gate C17 went viral. Trending top 3. The press kept asking. Damien read without changing his expression. Not happy, not worried, not proud. He just sighed lightly. "I told you. I don't want to make a fuss. I want to change," Lucy said. "But it's strange. Even though it's such a big matter, he still stays so calm that I can't understand." Damien smiled softly. "Calm down. Not because I'm strong, but because I've been hurt, and I don't want anyone else to be hurt again." That statement brought tears to many people's eyes. Tears of empathy, not pity. Jonathan Reed stood up and walked over to Damien. "Damien, if you need investor support, I will make sure Skywave doesn't lose confidence during this period." Damien looked at him grateful. "Thank you, Jonathan. But trust is not lost because of the press. It is lost because we refuse to face the truth." Jonathan nodded vigorously. "That's why you're the one leading the company." Amidst the deep silence in the cabin, a weak voice rang out. "It's the little girl from earlier from row 3. Uncle Damien." Damien turned back. The little girl took the second napkin and drew another shape, an airplane with larger wings. "I drew this plane for you, Uncle. Your plane will fly further." Damien crouched down, took the paper, and for the first time today, his eyes welled up with tears. The seemingly small things have the strongest impact. But just as the cabin began to calm down, an internal alarm sounded from the overhead speakers. Marissa Lee's voice rang out in Damien's earpiece. "Damien, there's one more thing you need to know right now." Damien frowned slightly. "What's the matter?" Marissa took a deep breath. "We recently checked our monthly ticket allocation system. There were 27 cases where first-class tickets were downgraded to economy without valid reasons. Damien looked down at the ground. Marissa continued, her voice heavy as lead. And most of the people who were demoted were in the same group as you. The cabin didn't hear the call, but they could feel the air next to Damien's shift. Lucy stepped closer. Sir, what is it? Damien replied, his voice low but clear. Worse than I thought. Not just a mistake, a recurring motif. Lucy opened her eyes wide. You mean systematic discrimination? Damien didn't say yes, but his silence was the answer. Captain Reynolds approached Mr. Cole. Would you like to cancel the flight? I can take you down to handle the situation. Damien looked at him. No, the flight is still taking off. But before we do, I need to say one more thing. Reynolds nodded and stepped back. Damien turned back to face the cabin. All eyes were on him, not because he was the CEO, but because he was the one voicing what many in the cabin had felt, suspected, endured, but no one had said out loud. Damien said, I will not let this be buried under the word mistake. Not today. Not when we have all seen the truth. He stopped. The compressed air seemed about to burst. Skywave will investigate the entire system, and I will take the lead. I can't promise a fix in a day, but I promise to start today. A man in the back seat said loudly. We believe you. Another woman continued. You are not alone. Then applause broke out, widely heard throughout the cabin. Not loud, but deep, like a commitment. Damien sat back down in chair 1A. Lucy put the glass of water on the table. Sir, you did what many people dare not. Damien looked at the napkin in his hand and said, I'm not trying to be a hero. I just don't want another kid to grow up being told, you have to be twice as good to be good enough. Lucy pursed her lips, trying not to cry. Outside the window, the sun finally sank behind the runway, and in the first-class cabin, a new consciousness was awakening. A big change is coming, and Damien knew. He was now more than just a CEO leading an airline. He is leading a transformation of an entire system, and of people who suffered the same thing as him. The first-class cabin gradually became quiet after a few minutes of being shaken by the truth. Not the silence of exhaustion, but a strange kind of peace, like when the surface of the sea flattens after a big wave, beautiful but still reverberating in the water. Damien sat in seat 1, gently smoothing out the napkin the girl had given him. The cabin lights illuminated the doodle, standing there small but hopeful. Lucy stood near him, watching intently. Sir, do you need water? She asked softly. Damien replied with a slight smile. Thank you, Lucy. Your presence has helped me more than a glass of water. Lucy paused for a second. She didn't think such a simple sentence could make her chest heat up like this. It was rare for someone to acknowledge the efforts of a newcomer like her. The atmosphere suddenly calmed down when Captain Reynolds' voice came over the intercom. Dear passengers, we are taking the final steps before taking off. Please remain in your seats. Those familiar words suddenly became different, as if this cabin was about to embark not just on a flight, but on a new journey, a journey of justice, of courage, of change. But just when the cabin seemed to have calmed down, Karen suddenly stood up, her hands shaking slightly. Sir, Damien, I have something I need to give you. The whole cabin turned its eyes to her. Tom swallowed, wondering what she was going to do. Karen walked slowly towards Damien, pulling out a carefully folded letter from her pocket. I have kept this for a long time, but today, I think you should see it. Damien looked up. What letter is it? Karen handed over the paper, her voice hoarse. It was a passenger report. A few months ago, a black passenger. And he wrote in great detail about being questioned, having his seat changed, being treated unfairly. Damien took it slowly. He opened the letter. The handwriting was hurried. He said that the man had bought a first-class ticket, but was downgraded to economy because he had sold his seat to a priority passenger. The writer said that he felt unworthy even though he had paid the same price as everyone else. And the last part of the letter made Damien stop. I just hope that one day the airline will see that I am not a stranger. I am just a person trying to be better every day. But I feel like I have to ask permission to exist here. Damien took a deep breath. He read the last sentence slowly, as if savoring each word. Lucy covered her mouth. Tears fell without her realizing it. Jonathan whispered from behind. That's why you have to do this, Damien. Damien folded the letter and placed it on his knee. His voice was low and deep, but it resonated in everyone's heart. No one, no one in this world has to ask permission to be respected. Karen continued, her voice choked. That day, I was on cabin duty. I didn't directly handle the incident, but I witnessed it. I kept quiet, and from that day on, I thought about it every night. The whole cabin fell silent. Karen took a deep breath. Today, when I saw him, his eyes, his calmness, I saw the man in the letter again, and I knew I couldn't keep silent anymore. Damien looked at Karen. No judgment, no anger, just a look of someone trying to understand the heart of someone who has fallen too far, but is trying to muster up the courage to come back. Lucy suddenly walked up to Karen and put her hand on her arm. A small action, but enough to say, "You are not alone." Karen trembled slightly. Her eyes were red. She whispered, "I'm sorry. For everything." Damien said, "I don't need to hear apologies over and over again. I need to see change." Karen bowed her head low. "I will change, even if I have to start from negative numbers." As soon as the cabin quieted down, the internal speaker came on. The internal investigation team requested to meet Mr. Damien Cole in person before takeoff. Reynolds stepped out, slightly surprised. "This notice was not sent by me." Damien looked up. "So from the system center," Reynolds nodded. But before Damien could get up, his phone vibrated 3 times in a row, signaling an urgent message from the system. He turned on the machine, and his whole body froze for a second. Lucy saw Damien's expression change very quickly. "Sir, what's the matter?" Damien read aloud so everyone could hear. Latest report. The ticket log tampering case doesn't just involve Karen. Someone else is behind all 27 passenger changes. That person is her supervisor, and he's at Hudson International right now. The cabin air exploded in shock. Tom exclaimed, "No, no way." Karen was weak, almost unable to stand. "My manager. But I think those are just small changes in shifts." Lucy whispered. "So, there is someone in charge." Damien clenched the phone, his eyes deep as abysses. "What is his name?" he asked. The next message appears. "Mark Dempsey, Skywave Regional Supervisor." Karen's eyes widened. "Oh my God, he lives just downstairs. I've seen him walking between the gates." Damien stood up for the first time since the beginning of the story. His voice became cold. "If he's here, I need to talk to him before the flight takes off." Reynolds stepped forward, worried. "Mr. Cole, is it safe to get off the plane now? You're the center of media attention." Damien said, "I'm not going far. I'm just going down to see someone who needs to hear what I have to say." Lucy stepped forward, worried. "Sir, let me go with you." Damien looked at her, his eyes softening. "No, you stay in the cabin. Keep an eye on things here for me." Lucy bit her lip but nodded. "Yes." Damien walked to the door of the plane. The whole cabin watched him. It wasn't that they were afraid he would be harmed. They were afraid that the pain he was carrying was too great. But when he stood at the door, Damien turned back. He looked at each of them, Lucy, Karen, Tom, Richard, Jonathan, and said in a voice as steady as steel, but as warm as fire, "I'm not going to be angry. I'm going to end this." And he stepped out of the compartment. The door closed behind him. In the cabin, no one said a word. Lucy clenched her hands on her apron, her heart pounding. "Please, come back safely." Karen whispered through ragged breaths. "He is about to come face to face with the person who is really behind it all." Jonathan looked out the door, his eyes determined. "If anyone is strong enough to do this, it's him." Richard nodded slightly. "Not just strong, but kind enough not to turn it into war." And in that moment, the cabin almost held its breath. Everyone knew what happens next will change everything. Not just for Damien, but for the system he's trying to save. The hallway leading to the Hudson International boarding gate was much colder than the cabin. Not because of the air conditioning, but because the space held an invisible tension, the silence of things about to be revealed. Damien walked slowly, each step echoing clearly on the polished floor. The white light overhead reflected off his dark coat, stretching his shadow behind him as a reminder he walked not just for himself, but for those who had been silent for too long. As Damien approached the glass doors, A large man in a dark gray suit stood with his back turned. His hair was cropped high, his shoulders broad, his stance uncomfortably arrogant. Damien recognized it immediately. Mark Dempsey, the man behind dozens of doctored reports, the shadowy power behind Skywave. Mark turned just as Damien approached. He gave him an unreadable smile, half friendly, half challenging. "Ah, Mr. Cole, we meet at last." Damien did not return the smile. He stood straight, his eyes fixed on the man who treated every mistake as a game. "I heard you wanted to see me," Damien said. Mark crossed his arms and tilted his head as if observing a shorter opponent. "Oh, I would. I have to admit, you've got social media buzzing. Pretty impressive." Damien's expression did not change. "It's not me who is causing the heat. It's the misconduct of your subordinates that is causing the heat." Mark let out a short, cold laugh. "Under me, Damien, do you think I have enough free time to edit some passenger logs?" Damien replied, "You don't fix it, but you order it." Mark shrugged. "And you have proof?" Damien looked him straight in the eye. "I have." Mark narrowed his eyes. "Send it to me." Damien was silent for a beat, and then said, "No need to send it. I'll tell you this. In an interview just before he was escorted off the plane, Brian said he was behind a program called Priority Image Rotation." Mark froze for half a second. Just half a second. But it was enough for Damien to know he had hit the nail on the head. Mark took a deep breath, his face returning to a fake calm. "You don't understand internal processes, Damien. I just optimize the customer experience." Damien asked by weeding out passengers who don't look image perfect enough to sit in first class. Mark raised his eyebrows, not answering. Damien took a step forward. "By editing the log, making their tickets disappear." Mark smiled faintly. "Sometimes, some spots need to go to people who are really high performers. It's business strategy. Don't overdo it." Damien looked at him, his eyes sharp as cutting. "No, that is discrimination." Mark was starting to lose his patience. "Damien, you're too sensitive for a CEO. I had a meeting with some people in New York this afternoon, and everyone said you're getting softer and softer. First-class customers demand a good facade, you know that. Who wants to sit next to someone dressed like they just came out of the gym?" Damien squeezed his hand. "Do you think a hoodie reduces a person's worth?" Mark shrugged nonchalantly. "I think the first impression of a customer is more important than the feelings of some people, especially those who do not look socially acceptable." The words cut like a cold knife. Not that Damien hadn't heard it before, but he had heard it from a recruiter 20 years ago when he was rejected from his first job simply because he didn't fit the company's image. That painful memory resurfaced. But Damien didn't let it control him again. He stepped closer to Mark, only half a meter away. His eyes held no anger, but the determination of someone who had had enough. "Mark, you don't optimize for revenue. You optimize for bias. And you do it with unchecked power. Today, it ends." Mark laughed louder. "Finish, Damien. I'm not some stewardess you can fire at will. I have connections. I have superiors. I have shareholders backing me up." Damien calmly, "I know. And I have something too." Mark raised his eyebrows. "What?" Damien replied slowly, but with weight. "I have the power to run the system in an emergency. I have the council behind me. And most importantly, I have the truth." Mark crossed his arms, his voice sarcastic. "Who cares about the truth? The media will forget it in 48 hours." Damien looked at him like someone who no longer understood how the world was changing, not when it's shot from 30 different angles. Not when our brand is being dragged down, and not when the very employees you threatened are standing up. Mark stiffened slightly. Damien continued, "He didn't just edit logs. He created a culture of fear, holding employees to false standards. And he thought no one would dare speak up." Mark waved his hand. "They wouldn't dare. Those kids need jobs," Damien said. "But Karen said it. Lucy said it. And they were just the beginning." Mark started to fidget, turning to look out the window as if to avoid Damien's gaze. Damien recognized that moment. The moment when a powerful person begins to realize his power is no longer valid. He said, "I have the authority to fire you immediately under Article 14. Abuse of power, causing brand risk." Mark turned his head, eyes wide. "Are you kidding?" "No way. I have to go through 3 levels of approval," Damien replied. "Normally, yes. But Skywave just activated the crisis-level override procedure, and I'm the one with the signing authority. Mark turned pale. No, no way. Who gave you permission? Damien picked up the phone. The call was in conference mode. A calm male voice rang out. This is the chairman of the board, Robert Hale. Mark Dempsey, you are suspended immediately. Your access card and system have been locked. Mark stood frozen. Another female voice said, We're going to send a federal summons. Be prepared to work with the Justice Department. Damien looked straight at Mark and said the last sentence. You weren't fired for making mistakes. You were fired for making the wrong choice and still thinking you were right. Mark no longer resisted. He was approached by two internal security officers and asked to leave. He only had time to turn back to look at Damien, his eyes no longer arrogant but desperate. You just killed my career. Damien replied softly, but clearly, no. You did it yourself. I just stopped you from hurting others. As Mark was led away, Damien stood alone in the long hallway. The distant airport loudspeakers, the sound of footsteps mixed together, but he heard clearly what was echoing in his heart. One chapter has not only closed, another more difficult but more righteous is opening. He turned his head to look at the plane. The yellow light reflected on the window like a call to return. He took a deep breath. It was time to return to the people waiting for him in the cabin. With Lucy, with Karen, with the passengers who believed in him, and with the real him, strong, calm, but also emotional. Damien walked to the plane. The flight is about to continue. The Skywave plane sat quietly under the yellow lights of Hudson International's runway. There was no chatter, no chaos, just an eerie silence, a silence that anyone who has ever suffered injustice and then been vindicated knows all too well. Damien Cole stepped onto the gangway back to the plane. A breeze brushed against his sleeves, a cool reminder that all storms must eventually pass. When the plane doors opened, the cabin fell silent. No one spoke, but everyone stood up, one by one, quietly, more meaningful than any applause. Lucy Parker, her eyes still red with emotion, was the first to approach him. Mr. Cole, welcome back. Her voice was shaky but proud. Damien looked at her, his eyes softening. Thank you, Lucy. Not just for what you did, but for showing me something I thought I had forgotten. Lucy tilted her head. What is it, sir? That there are still people despite their weaknesses who choose to do the right thing. As Damien walked down the aisle, the passengers who had witnessed the whole thing gently stepped aside, giving him a space like an honorary passage. A middle-aged man gently touched his shoulder. You made me teach my son a lesson tonight. Never bow down to wrong. One woman whispered, I wish my daughter were here to see this. She was treated like this, and thought she had to accept it. An old man bowed his head with rare respect. Son, you did what the world should have done long ago. Damien listened to it all. The words did not inflate his ego. On the contrary, they made his heart sink. Because he knew there were too many others who did not stand up, who did not see justice, who did not have their stories recorded. Today, he is just one of thousands who have experienced this. When she returned to the first-class row, Karen Mitchell, who had spoken early, stood up and said, Mr. Cole, I'm sorry for letting things go this far. Damien shook his head. It's not your fault. What's wrong is not the initial silence, but the fact that people know it's wrong and still stubbornly continue. You chose to stand up. That's more important. Karen pursed her lips, her eyes grateful. The air fell silent for a moment. Then, Damien returned to seat 2A, the seat that should have been his all along. The seat looked exactly the same, but he didn't feel the same as when it all started. He placed his hand on the chair, as if he were placing his hand on the years of his youth when he was judged by his appearance. The early days when he was rejected for opportunities because he didn't fit the image. The times when he was ignored by restaurant staff because they thought he wasn't a VIP. The scrutinizing eyes every time he entered a meeting room without wearing a high-class suit, and he sat down. This time, no one asked for papers. No one suspected anything. No one tried to take away the rights he had earned with half a lifetime of hard work. The cabin lights turned to warm mode. The new captain's voice came over the loudspeaker system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. I want to thank you for your patience during a challenging evening. We will be taking off in a few minutes, and I promise that Skywave will from this day forward be safe, not only in our technology, but also in the way we treat every single person on board. A light applause broke out, not loud, but genuine. Lucy handed Damien a new glass of water. Her voice was small but clear. "You changed my life tonight." Damien looked at her and smiled. "No, Lucy, you changed it yourself. I was just lucky enough to be there to see it." As the plane began to taxi, the sky outside the window was a deep blue-black. The runway lights trailed behind like tiny stars. Damien leaned his head back and closed his eyes for a moment. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, not because of victory, but because he saw that there was hope in the world, however fragile it sometimes seemed. He heard a small notification in his AirPods. "Damien, I've contacted the federal office. They want to see you when you land to open a formal investigation." It was Robert Hale, chairman of the council. Damien opened his eyes. "Good. This isn't just a personal matter. It needs to be thoroughly investigated." Robert replied, "I have never been prouder of my firm than I am tonight. You have shown us something we have long forgotten: responsibility." Damien lowered his voice sincerely, not the responsibility to the brand, but to the people. The plane took off. The thrust made the cabin shake slightly, then everything stabilized. The city lights on the ground grew smaller, then disappeared altogether as the plane passed through the thick cloud cover. A peaceful light appeared above the sky, was completely still. Damien looked at the scene and let out a soft sigh. Sometimes he thought to see the light, one just has to go high enough. Jasmine Parker, a passenger sitting in row 3, suddenly turned around and asked Mr. Cole, "Do you think things will really be resolved tomorrow?" Damien replied, his voice slow enough for TTS to pause softly. "No one can solve everything in one day. But today, at least we took one step." Jasmine smiled, her eyes slightly red. "I have a black son. He gets judged because of the way he dresses. I'm going to tell him this, so he knows sometimes he can win." Damien looked at her, then out the window where the sky stretched endlessly. "Not to win," he said, "but to stand." A silence fell. Not a silence of fear or weariness, but a silence of someone who had just witnessed the right thing happen before their eyes. Lucy stood in the galley, placing her hands lightly on the metal wings that had just been attached to her shirt. She whispered to herself, "You made the right choice today." When the story reaches its quietest point, the YouTube narrator's voice breaks in gentle yet profound. "And dear friend, if this story makes you think of a time when you were judged, or a time when you wish someone would stand up for you, please leave like a share or a subscription. Not for me, but for the stories that deserve to be heard." The plane steadied in the sky, drifting in the nightlight, as if embracing all the imperfections of each person inside. Damien put a hand to his heart. He wasn't proud of being CEO. He was proud that he hadn't been silent tonight. And sometimes, that's enough to change a system.